Today on the Combat Perspective, questions that you'd ask a veteran that you're too afraid to. Hey, thanks for joining me today on the Combat Perspective. Today I have Sam Thompson with me. He's going to be asking a few questions that I challenged him to ask a veteran or a combat veteran that you normally wouldn't ask. So thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to even beat around the bush here on this because it's a different thing for someone to say, ask me the questions that people don't normally ask. So I had to sit and think about that for a bit because obviously you don't want to ask questions that are going to be too insensitive. And so, but there's a lot of questions that sit out there. And knowing that you've served time in the military, in the Army, how many tours of combat did you have?
4 tours.
4 tours, okay. Yeah. So, and what was the longest stint of your time?
17 months.
17, okay.
Yeah.
So the first question that I came up with was knowing that you were in 4 different tours for, one of them being obviously for 17 months. Was there ever a fear, because you were married? Were you married the entire time?
I was married for 3 of the deployments. We were engaged for the first one.
Okay, engaged for the first one,
yep.
And then married for the other 3.
Yep.
So during that time, was there ever a concern or a thought of your significant other potentially not wanting to be with you by the time your tour was ended?
Yeah, so great question, and I did not think I would have a question like this. So thanks for catching me off guard a little bit when I was reading through these earlier. But so yes, the answer is yes, but it is a little bit different than most people would think. Okay. So most people would have that fear of my wife is going to cheat on me or she's going to leave me. I'm gone 17 months, a year, without seeing me, right? So that's where most people, their head goes to. And for a lot of people, that is a factor. My wife and I have been together since I was 12. She was 13. So us making it through my first deployment didn't concern me about the rest that were coming up. What I was concerned about is how war was going to change me.
Okay.
So I was concerned that, was I going to be the man she expected when I came back home?
Sure.
Was I going to be, on my last deployment, we had Benton, our son, already. So was I going to be the father that she expected? Dealing with PTSD and a traumatic brain injury already, my wife has always said that she could see changes in me, even though I couldn't. So at what point is it going to be too much for her to handle and decide that she wants to jump ship? So the fear was there, but it was more internal, mental health and
Sure.
how war was going to change me.
No, that's a great response actually, and that's great to hear. Especially like as you said too, you kind of laid it out there really well. After the first tour, there was no more. That worry wasn't even there,
right?
For that specific thing. So that's a great answer. Following into that, because of your time in the service, how many years were you in the service?
10 years.
10 years in the service. So following that up, obviously you got married and you had a child, right there at your last deployment. So how do you feel that the time in the military, what pieces affected your life the most that you brought back into your personal life, and where do you think that you had struggles in there as well?
Yeah. So another great question. This one is a double-edged sword. So I would say my patience has changed for the good and the bad.
Okay.
So a lot of times, and anybody that was in the service or deployed or anything like that, even people that have personal stories related to that, first responders, anyone who has to travel, right? When you get back home and you're in a third world country and you don't have those luxuries of the United States,
yeah. I
remember that my wife Brooke would get mad because Starbucks was taking 5-10 minutes into the drive-through, right? And just the simple pleasures in life that you just realize you guys have it pretty easy. I don't know why you're complaining about this. And I would always be like, hey, just have patience. I could wait for days. On the other hand, my patience was extremely thin for a better word of stupid people.
Okay.
Let's call it. So
because your expectation of certain things might be higher.
Yeah. Being in the Army, being in combat, the weaker links or the people that don't have the mindset for it, they work themselves out, sure. Right? Yep. So as a platoon sergeant, one of my jobs was before deployment was make sure everyone's physically and mentally fit, right? So you want the best in your platoon because you're going to count on them to save your life. You're going to want them to, in return, save your life and vice versa, right? So there's not a lot of people that you just have to scratch your head on and say, what the heck were you thinking? Mm-hmm. But when you get back to the States and you're just in Walmart or something like that, sometimes it's extremely hard to bite your tongue. So that was one of the big things that changed. Leadership. Leadership could go on. We could have, a whole 15 episodes just on leadership. But when you deploy at a young age, I don't know if you completely comprehend what you're doing.
Sure.
Right? As soon as you start getting leadership roles and people are in charge of you and you understand the mission and you understand that the people out there that you're supporting and protecting are people just like you start having a different mindset to it. And so you build these leadership traits that you want your soldiers to have as well. And then you reflect that upon your life, right? Mm-hmm. So I tell my guys at work all the time, it's like, I had toxic leadership when I was a young soldier. Yeah. And that's one thing that I said, I am not going to bestow upon other people when I climbed up in the ranks. And I take that to my personal life as well, right? Sure. So I don't think a leader is do what I say, not as I do. Mm-hmm. And it's definitely a leader who leads from the front, right? So certain situations you can't always lead from the front, but be out there, be talking to the guys, stuff like that. That's a leadership trait that I take out. And once again, we could go on and on for a lot of things, but I'll cut it as those two big things.
I think we know that there's multiple books out there that are going to follow up on leadership and things like that. So like you said, 10 episodes of that would just, it would be a nonstop thing. So you said, obviously you've already mentioned you suffered an injury.
Yes.
in the Army. So let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. So during my 4 deployments, I was injured a few times. The more severe ones were traumatic brain injury. Mm-hmm. The first was involved in a vehicle accident. The second one was explosion. So the second one was on my second deployment. I was medevaced from Iraq to Landstuhl, Germany. I was in the hospital for about a month before I went back to my duty station in Germany, and I had to sit out the rest of that deployment. Injured my back and my neck on a rocket on my 3rd deployment, and then I was wounded by a small arms fire on my last deployment. It sounds really cool saying, hey, I got shot, but it was more of a ricochet. But it could have been a lot worse. Obviously, yeah. I thank my lucky stars for that. I thank God for protecting me during those deployments, but I did have a few close calls. Sure. But luckily, I was able to maintain relatively pretty good health.
Certainly one of the blessed ones that that came out with minor scripts than compared to many others that obviously we lost too. With dealing with that, I think you mentioned earlier something about PTSD in there as well.
Yep.
So that's something that you've dealt with.
And once again, the whole reason why this is called My Combat Perspective is everyone's going to have their own opinion, their own perspective on what happens, right? So I've talked to multiple guys in the same engagement, same firefight that I've been in, and they saw it completely different than what I have, right? So it's the same thing with PTSD. So most of the time, you don't really know you have it, right? So for me anyways, I was in Ramadi in 2006, 2007. We had the Battle of Ramadi. It was the worst place in the world at the time. We were losing soldiers constantly. But I was just a young private just trying to do my job, right? Sure. So leading into that, I started seeing, after my traumatic brain injury, I started seeing a psychologist for my rehabilitation. And so he was trying to figure out what I experienced in order to help me physically and emotionally, right? So he would tell me, talk about one of your experiences. And there's certain triggers, and I'm not the psychologist, so I know a little bit about what he was trying to do, but he was trying to cue in on triggers that I have.
Sure.
And so there's this one firefight that we were in. It's called Battle for Donkey Island. It's a relatively famous battle that happened in Ramadi. And I was explaining to him, once we got ambushed, everything kind of slowed down. And we were so low to the ground because we didn't want to get hit that I could smell the dirt. I still could smell like the fresh dirt. And to this day, you know, I still kind of smell that, right? Sure. And so during the springtime, sometimes I still kind of get that smell and that trigger. And then, you know, losing quite a few friends, some battle buddies. A few of my soldiers were wounded. Luckily, none of my soldiers under my command ever died. But as soon as you start taking a knee, that you could reflect on those things, that's when it starts hitting you.
Sure.
And so one thing that I find fascinating, good and bad, is sometimes you hear about like Vietnam veterans.
Yes.
That it takes them 30, 40 years until they finally have their breaking point, right? And so I think eventually I'll have one of those, and I've came close a few times, but I haven't had that yet. So I think that everyone has to deal with it in their own way.
Sure.
But at one point, it catches up to you, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not a bad thing for it to catch up to you. Actually, it can be a very good stress reliever. And
I'm assuming it's freeing once you hit that point, and you can get through that process. And you know,
I hear it is, and hopefully one day
Sure,
I'll
sure.
know. So once again, this podcast and this YouTube channel is a way that I could talk about it too.
Yeah.
So I've been retired for 6 years now. Yep. And so this is me finally being able to talk about some of my experiences. And so that's exactly what this is intended for.
That's awesome. So let's talk. So we're talking about the combat perspective, and as you said, it's different for every soldier, every person that, you know, went through that. But I think some of the things that we see, we associate war with the thoughts of what we've seen in movies and we know from other people. But give me your perspective. Like, what was the one thing that actually put any fear or made you scared during that time?
Yeah. So the first deployment, even though it was the worst, it wasn't the scariest for me. Because I was a young guy, I wasn't married at the time, I didn't have children at the time. I didn't want to die, but I really wasn't afraid of it either.
Sure.
At that point, you think you're pretty invincible. As soon as you have a family and you start getting kids, that's when you get a little more. You pay attention a little bit more of how close things were, right? And so, let's see. The ones that really stick out for me, and well, let me add this really quick too. I think it's a quote. It may have been from the Band of Brothers. It may have been a movie, and it may have been someone who told me before. But it really stuck with me, and it was pretty much a saying that says, "Stop assuming you're going home. Assume you're gonna die." Okay. So you stop thinking about home. You're gonna die here. Just worry about getting your troops home like every day, right? So you go on a mission, just worry about getting home that day, right? 17 months, 9 months, 12 months, it's a long time for you to always be thinking about home, right? And so it is, as even though it sounds kind of dark humor, that's called the military humor, you just have to realize I'm probably gonna die. Make peace with that. And do your best to keep you and your guys alive every day, right? Now, the big question, the main question that you had is on my third deployment. That was my first deployment to Afghanistan. So my first deployment was in Ramadi, Iraq, by Fallujah and Hit, and then like the main Ramadi. And then second was in the Diyala province of Iraq. It's the West Baghdad area. Once I went from Iraq, which was pretty much street combat, like city, like house to house type work, to Afghanistan, it's a whole different perspective. It is night and day compared to fighting it. And being a seasoned combat vet with 2 deployments when a lot of soldiers haven't had one yet, and then going to Afghanistan, I was expecting it to be like Iraq. Well, they don't fight like Iraqis. They're extremely intelligent. They don't shoot and run like the Iraqis did. They stay and die. and they're in their own home turf, like the mountains. It's not like in a building. They're good. And so our base in my third deployment was by mountains.
Okay.
And so our average was we would get hit by 3 to 5 rockets a week. Our base was pretty small. It was less than a mile around. And I think the total was, in our whole deployment, we had over 300 something rockets land inside our compound area,
Gotcha.
right? So imagine playing Battleship, the game Battleship, and you are the ship, right? My job, I was in the infantry, so my whole job is to find the enemy and destroy them. My job was also the mortarman. So when we were on base, if we took any incoming, it was our responsibility to, no matter where we were, run straight back to our mortar position and return fire.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So we had a machine that could project where the rockets came from based on the trajectory of where it's coming and where it hits. And then we shoot a back azimuth and we know where they're at. And so it's our job to shoot back at them, right? And so you could be on the other side of the base and you hear the and the boosh. You gotta run, and you just hope you don't get hit. That's how I hurt my neck and back, as a rocket landed by me. Wow. And so that made me realize, what am I doing here? I think every soldier has that moment.
Sure.
Probably anybody that it puts themselves in the line of duty, police officers, anything like that. You get that moment of, why am I doing this, right? And it lasts a little bit. So that was one of those moments. I even wrote about it before, and it pretty much went like this. As the dust is settling down into the ground, I take off my helmet and look around, and I look up in the sky and say, why God? And it was just one of those things, like, out of the chaos, it's like, why am I here? Why did I sign up for this, And then the time that I didn't even know if I was going to make it back home, and I was pretty fearful, was my fourth tour. My fourth tour was a lot different because it was Afghanistan was starting to calm down a little bit, and we went on a lot of missions. Normally we would fly in helicopters to where we needed to go, or we would take convoys and go to this area. So we were on a 7-day mission on a convoy. And on our second day going out, we went by this village and we got ambushed. A few of our Afghani army guys were killed. We ended up having to drop a bomb, a few 500-pound bombs, to kill the insurgents. One of them didn't go off. And imagine an F-18 flying with a 500-pound bomb pretty high up. It hits the ground and it doesn't detonate. It goes pretty far in the ground.
Sure.
So we had to locate it and mark it. And on our way back, we were going to blow it up, right? And so once again, this is right where we were just in a fight, right? So on our way back, 2-3 days later, we set up, we get ready to go, and of course they were waiting for us and they ambushed us. And so at the time, my squad was out setting up a mortar position outside of the truck. I had the door open so I could communicate with them. I was eating, of course. You eat when you could get the time to. I was eating some beef chili, I think it was. And I heard the first crack. And it's amazing after how many times firefights, like, you kind of know, like, how close rounds are just based on the sound of them, right? And so all I do is I look over at my guys and I see that they're dancing because the rounds are coming straight for them. Normally the enemy doesn't like mortars because we can reach out and touch them pretty far away. Sure. So I saw my guys dancing around, which means the bullets were getting pretty close to them. You could see some dirt kicking up, some dust kicking up. And so my driver was able to get back to the vehicle. My gunner wasn't. It looked like he fell and he rolled underneath the vehicle. So I assumed he was shot. So my driver jumps in, shuts the door. I look at him and say, hey, open your door, call his name, see if he's right underneath. And so he opens the door, and you could hear the rounds hitting off the side of the MRAP, and the shrapnel from the bullets are spraying into the truck, right? And so I wasn't thinking as clear as I should. And at that time, we had pretty much PID. We had identification on where the enemy was, and I noticed that they weren't towards the back of the vehicle. So I told my driver to drop the ramp. And these are MRAPs, and the ramps drop down, and they drop pretty fast because of the weight. And it's pretty much like D-Day. The boats that would drop the
Yeah,
ramps, right?
yeah.
And as soon as it got about level, I realized that was a terrible decision because we started seeing rounds come into our truck. And the rounds were coming into our truck. They were hitting our boxes of food. They were hitting the seats. A few tracer rounds came in, so you could see the red streak coming into the truck. And I immediately told my driver, raise the ramp, raise the ramp, raise the ramp, right? And luckily, our guys didn't get hit. I had an interpreter in the back as well, and another soldier who was with the interpreter. And so the ramp raised. My gunner is possibly bleeding out underneath the truck, and the 240 Bravo, he wasn't up there, so I jumped in the gun turret and started suppressing the enemy with the 240. And so during that, I realized at some point that my hand felt really hot. And so I assumed something that we call hot brass. I'm sure you experienced it before, is when you shoot guns, sometimes the casings like land on your neck or in your clothing, and you feel the hot brass start burning you, right? So I assumed that's what it was, and I looked down.
Not the case.
It was not the case. My glove was ripped up a little bit, and I was bleeding, and I realized that at some point I took some shrapnel from the small arms fire.
Oh.
So while I'm suppressing the enemy, it's starting to die down. The truck next to us got hit by an RPG. And so in the midst of that, I start questioning, what the heck am I doing here? No idea. You know, I have a probably at that time a 8-month-old baby, got a wife, and I'm in Afghanistan. And the thing about my 4th deployment was I didn't have to go. I volunteered to go because one of my soldiers just had a baby, and he was pretty torn up from thinking about leaving the baby. Sure. And even though I just had one, he was a soldier that was underneath me, and I said, you know what, I'll go. You could go ahead and stay with your family. So those are one of the times that you just don't know what's going to happen. Luckily, it turned out all right. You know, got bandaged up by the medic. I was able to finish up that mission and get seen afterwards. But those are one of the times it's like, am I going to make it out of here?
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine, man. I shouldn't say that because I can't imagine that. I've not been in that type of situation before, but to hear your perspective and how that sets your mind in that in that combat perspective, it's incredible. So I guess my last question is, with all of that, there's a lot of camaraderie that has to be in a unit. You guys rely on each other a lot. So since your time now being out, you've been out, you said, for 6 years.
Yeah.
So, do you still maintain contact with anyone from your units or from the troops in the past?
Yeah. So when you get to a duty station, you're there about 2 years is your stint. I went to Germany right away. That's a 3-year stint because I brought my wife over. We stayed there for 5 years, almost 6 years. And so soldiers are always rotating through your platoon. So probably in general, I've been with over 100, 150 guys in different platoons, but there's always those few that stick out and that you stay in touch with. So I'd say I talk to about 10 or 15 people. Most of those are people that, he saved my life, I saved his, we have a crazy story. Some are the ones that you just get along with. The Army is a huge melting pot. I never thought I would be, best friends with a 5'0" Southern boy named Gurley who had chewing tobacco the size of a baseball in his mouth 24/7. You could barely understand him as it was, but those are the guys that you're with, and sometimes you'll never forget them. You may not be in contact, but you always share that brotherhood with them.
Sure.
And then there's a few soldiers I stay in contact with that either they meant a lot to me for leadership purposes or I meant a lot to them. So there's a few soldiers that still communicate with me and ask me for advice about what I would do in certain situations. And sometimes most of those soldiers were I never thought would stay in the military. And I did my best to either get them out or get them right. Because those are the two choices. You can't be mediocre in the military. You either need to know your job and do it to the best of your ability and become a leader, or you just need to get out of the military. So it's cool that those guys still stay in contact with me.
No, that's awesome. That's fantastic. And the fact that, like you said, they reach out to you and ask for your opinion. I'm assuming so they're still in the military.
Yes.
That's awesome. That's incredible too, because that just goes to show, like, like you said, like there's certain people that maybe you stay in contact with because of their leadership, but obviously you've got a strong piece of leadership that that you've portrayed with other soldiers and stuff like that they found valuable and meaningful to them. And that's a huge thing. So I appreciate you talking about that.
Yeah, and I appreciate you coming on. And I'm sure we'll do some more videos in the future.
Yeah.
We didn't get to all your questions, but I'm sure you'll have a few more too. If you haven't checked out Sam Thompson's podcast, it's Life Right Now. You could check it out. He's putting out a lot of good content. A few videos in the future. One that I'm going to be in here shortly, but the one that I just finished was about education and what kids are learning in school.
Yeah.
It was a good one. And then I also like the working out one. Your friend who's in LA, is it?
San Diego.
San Diego, yeah. So
yeah.
he's what I liked about it, he didn't just talk about muscles. He talked about mental fitness too,
yeah.
and meditation, sleeping, everything else. And,
yeah.
Your journey with that as well. So,
yeah.
Keep putting out the good stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, he's going to be back soon too. So
all right. Awesome. All right. Well, we'll see you guys later, and thanks for joining the Combat Perspective.
Let's see it. 25 Henry, return your previous frequency, please.